Él cuenta con una especialidad en seguridad y salud ocupacional de la Universidad del Sur de Columbia. A su vez, él está representando a la empresa Predictive Solutions. Desde el año 2007 hasta la actualidad, ha desarrollado en esta empresa la experiencia práctica de campo como profesional de seguridad en la industria y construcción, identificando los aspectos de gestión de los sistemas de seguridad en empresas y cómo, a través del uso de tecnología y técnicas avanzadas, es posible mejorarlos. Ha desarrollado también actividades de benchmarking en los aspectos de datos y procesos, ampliando los aspectos de ampliación para los equipos de inspección. Anteriormente, desde el año 2004 hasta el año 2007, se desempeñó como director de seguridad en Turner Construction Company, desarrollando actividades de planificación e implementando y supervisando hasta 20 programas de seguridad y salud a través de las áreas de gerencias de seguridad. Desde el año 2003 hasta el año 2004, como director de seguridad, salud y medio ambiente en Wheelabrator Hudson Falls, desarrollando un nuevo sistema de seguridad que incrementó la seguridad y responsabilidad personal en las instalaciones de la empresa. Carrie Assery viene con nosotros en el tema Leading Safety Metrics, Measure by Accomplishment, conduciendo a la medición de la seguridad basada en resultados. Lo recibimos con un fuerte aplauso.
I want to thank ISCM for inviting me here to speak. Can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up. All right. So just so I know everybody's listening, every now and then, can you nod your head so that, there we go. So I know that I'm being heard and understood. So today I'm going to talk about leading safety metrics. I'm going to talk about the difference between leading and lagging indicators. If that's a new concept for you, I want to fill you in on what I see as the difference between the two. We'll go through some case studies on how leading indicators can help and improve the process of safety. And then we'll talk about some best practices as it relates to the collection of those leading indicators. So a lagging indicator is basically an event that happens where there's usually damage. Somebody gets hurt or there's damage to property. In the United States, we use EMR, that's Experience Modification Rate. It's basically an insurance term that says, hey, if your company injures a lot of people, you're going to pay more for insurance. So that's what an EMR rate does. In the United States, we have the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they have two terms. They have a total case incident rate and a DART rate, which is days away, restricted, or transferred. And those are basically injury rates. Those are rates that say somebody was injured at the workplace, and then it measures the severity of that injury. So how long was that person out of work? And then we also have property damage. That could be a vehicle accident or what we call a general liability claim. That could be damage to equipment or to property, environmental damage, things like that. The common thing about a lagging indicator is once it's happened, there's nothing you can do to undo that damage. For example, if you have a fatality at your workplace, there is nothing you can do to bring that person back to life. What's done is done. The best outcome from a lagging indicator is that you learn from it and you apply that to prevent injuries in the future. But that is a very costly learning process. How many people do you have to hurt? How many people have to die before you start to do the things that you need to do to prevent those injuries? So this approach is very reactive. When an injury occurs, you do an incident investigation, you find out what happened, and then you try to learn from that and apply some kind of corrective action. But it's very reactive. Nothing is done until that injury occurs or that damage occurs. Even though you could have seen it coming, right? Nothing happens until that injury occurs, that point of contact. So it's a very reactive approach. So from a safety aspect, my background is safety. I have over 20 years in the safety industry. And I hated being measured by my failures. No matter what I did to prevent injuries, I was always measured solely off the failures, which is an injury, right? And I never liked that because I tried to do everything I could from as David said earlier, a duty of care to prevent those injuries. I was always measured solely on those failures. So what I propose instead is you start looking ahead and measuring by your accomplishment. But let me ask you a question real quick. If we are measuring ourselves in the success of our safety programs based on injury rates, based on our failures, let me ask you a question. Let's say you have a high hazard industry, mining for example, and you have 0 injuries for the previous year. Would you consider this to be safe? Most people would say, absolutely, I had 0 injuries. But injuries are very interesting. 0 could mean one of 2 things. 0 could mean I'm working safely, therefore my outcomes are good. 0 could also mean I'm very lucky, right? If I continue to do this every day, right, stick my head in the proverbial alligator's mouth, right? If I work unsafely, I'm going to have injuries, right? David outlined the 2 industries, coal mining, right, versus the metal mining. And one is doing very well and one is doing not so well. And the difference is how they're approaching those hazards, right? Are they waiting to injuries happen or are they trying to be proactive? And that's where leading indicators come in. What are leading indicators? They're performance measures or performance indicators, and they can reveal at-risk behaviors, conditions, or processes such that action can be made before injuries occur. That's what a leading indicator is. And the difference between a leading and a lagging indicator is leading indicators can allow you to be proactive. But I want to clarify something. Just collecting leading indicators doesn't make you proactive. I'll give you a great example. If I get on a scale and measure my weight, right, does that help me lose weight? No. What do I have to do to lose weight? I have to diet. I have to exercise. Those are all the actions that I would take based on those measures. So simply collecting leading indicators does not make you proactive. Acting on those leading indicators proactively, that's what's going to make the difference between preventing injuries and not. So some advantages of leading indicator. A leading indicator is consequence-free. I'll give you a great example. If you see somebody driving a truck erratically, right, and you stop him and find out, hey, he's very drowsy, he's very fatigued, and you can work with him and make it so that he drives better, right, no damage has occurred. But if you wait until, I'm sure he's going to be okay, and then he wrecks the vehicle, right, the damage is done. Right? So a leading indicator is consequence-free. It allows you to act before any damage has been done. It also helps you define what is normal. For example, we have health and safety plans, right? They sit on our shelves and they say, this is what we're going to do within this mine or within this organization. Those are great. But what are we actually doing out in the facility? Your leading indicators are going to tell you what is normal. how close are you to those health and safety plans? Or how far apart are you from those health and safety plans, right? What we want and what we get are usually two very different things, right? And it's up to your management system to try to bring alignment so that what we want and what we get are very close together, right? But that takes a lot of effort, right? We can also define and communicate expectations. As we start to see what this information is, we can say, yes, we're going to tolerate that, or no, that's not acceptable. We need to make these changes. It could mean changing your health and safety plan. It could be helping to improve your culture. It could be coaching or mentoring, right? It could be any of those things to say, this is what we accept, this is not what we accept. It also helps you to focus resources. How many people here have unlimited resources? Right? Nobody. So as your leading indicators come in, and we have health and safety people within the organization, I want to put my resources, those are my people, my time, my effort, I want to put those where they're going to make the biggest difference, the biggest impact. So these leading indicators are going to give me an idea, where do I need help the most? Where am I going to most likely have an injury based on these observations? And I can focus resources on those areas. Now, there's two things that leading indicators can provide. They can provide prediction in the form of forecasting. So just like in the winter when it's cold, you can look to see, you can look on the weather, right, on the news and say, hey, it's going to be cold. You need to put a jacket on. That's forecasting, right? I can look at the data and it's going to say, based on these pressures, based on these weather patterns, I need to do this to prepare. I need to bring an umbrella, for example. That's forecasting. It's the same thing that can happen with your safety observations. You can help to predict the likelihood of something happening before an injury. I'll give you a great example. If you observe 10 times somebody failing to tie off for a fall hazard, right? Eventually, right, that's going to lead to an injury, right, if you don't do anything about that. So it's the same thing with leading indicators. As you start to develop patterns, especially a high trend and a high consequence trend, you're going to be able to see that and take action before it leads to an injury. And that's where prevention comes in. So it's prevention is acting on this data proactively. It's easier said than done, though. When an injury occurs, management's going to go, I want this investigated. I want to make sure this doesn't happen again, right? Where were they, though, before that injury occurred? Why aren't they acting on these at-risk conditions and behaviors before the injury occurred? That's the question you should be asking. Why do I have to wait for an injury to take action? Unfortunately, management, they can say, well, you know, you're just being reactionary, or you're being dramatic. You're saying, oh, you're going to say the sky is falling, right? So it's up to us to define what is normal, to see what is different, and paint that picture for management so that we can take those actions prior to the injury. So here's some common leading indicators. If anybody's read Dan Peterson, this is management activities. So what is management, what should they be doing when it comes to safety? There should be specific management activities based on their role within the organization. For example, line supervisors should have a different activity than, say, a project manager, right? But everybody should have an activity. It's everything from closing an open issue. An open issue would be something unsafe that was found, that we had to apply resources to correct it, right? Say, for example, you had a backup alarm not working on a loader, right? I can't fix that on the spot, so that becomes an open issue. And the time it takes to close that open issue and make it safe, right, says a lot about management's commitment to safety. Management walkthrough. How often does management walk through the facility, engage with employees, and talk safety? What do they usually talk about? Production, 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 or production, right? So why aren't they talking about safety? Those measurements, right, as they go through and engage with those employees, that says a lot about the culture, right, that commitment. And the one thing that I see the least is feedback. As people collect worksite safety observations, as people have behaved within the organization, how often do they get feedback saying that's good, that's bad, here's what we need to do to change? Right? How often is management engaging in that feedback process? The biggest source of leading indicators that everybody's probably already collecting is your basic worksite safety observations. I call those inspections. An inspection is just a collection of worksite observations. Observations can be behavioral. So if you have a behavior-based safety system, or if you're looking at behaviors, if you're looking at conditions, right? The condition of the electrical system, the condition of fall protection, the condition of housekeeping, right? Those are all worksite safety observations. There's a wealth of data, right? Every recognized hazard should have some kind of observational opportunity, right? We know where we're going to get people hurt. Mining industry has been around for how long, right? A very long time. We should know and be able to recognize the majority of those hazards, right? With the exception of the black swan, right? We should be able to see and anticipate where we're going to get people hurt. So things that can be safe and unsafe observations, the severity of the findings, where those observations occurred, right? Was it a particular area or mine? Was it a particular, was it within a camp? Was it along a roadway? Those kinds of things. And also the quality of the observations. I don't know if anybody, in the US we call the term pencil whipping. Has anybody heard that term? Pencil whipping is where you say nothing's ever wrong every single time, right? So you fill out your observation card and you say nothing's ever wrong, right? And that doesn't help anybody, right? So that's why we call it pencil whipping, because they don't really do a good observation. They just fill out the card for the sake of filling out the card, which is bad. I can't prevent injuries. I can't manage my risk if I don't know where my risk resides. Right? So you have to be open and honest. Sidney Decker has a great book called Just Culture. And it's an interesting book in that he says, you have to have a culture of discovery that says you have to put all the cards on the table and we call it in the US, air your dirty laundry. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, which basically says we know where our at-risks are. And it's okay to say that. That's the only way we can focus attention and fix it. But it's very uncomfortable to do that. It's very uncomfortable as a safety person because it may look like you're not doing your job, which is not true. Management may look at it and go, hey, you're making me look bad, and I'm going to get all this pressure from corporate, so quit making me look bad. So it's very difficult to avoid this pencil whipping. It takes a good, positive culture to be able to do that. And then you can look at your process performance. An assessment is different than a specific observation. An assessment is, it's like the difference between an audit would be something like you'd do annually. It's where you do a big management review of your full safety and health management system. But I can do an assessment very quickly. An assessment is kind of looking at the quality of a process. For example, if I look at the quality of worker orientation, right? Are they going through a good orientation? Are they getting the relevant information? Let me go out and question some people who've gone through orientation. Can they tell me where the muster points are? Or are people just getting rushed through an orientation, slapping a sticker on their hard hat, and they go to work and they have no idea what to expect out in the facility? So I can measure the quality of these processes fairly quickly, right? And then be able to make a change. Some other examples are my lockout tagout audit, my pre-task plan, that's PTP, pre-task planning effectiveness, the difference between solving a problem and fixing a problem, right? Instead of just fixing the same thing over and over and over again, we're actually solving for the root cause. So these are very common leading indicators, and the majority of those are going to come from my observations. Even when I look at my process performance, I can use a lot of my observations to help me determine the quality or efficacy or effectiveness of those processes. All right, so those are some common leading indicators. This, to me, is the best slide if you want to know the difference between leading and lagging indicators. To the right-hand side, as you guys are looking at it, the right-hand side, lagging indicators, those are recordable injuries or accident rates. And if you see in the middle, the incident defines leading and lagging indicators. On the left-hand side, we have leading indicators, everything from safety performance, hazard recognition. Now, it's pretty interesting because there's a sliding scale. For example, if anybody said, hey, near misses are a good leading indicator, those are right along the border of an incident. Sometimes the difference between a near miss and an injury is this much. It's luck, right? But if I go further up the scale from a near miss, I can look at observations. Before the observations, I can look at leading indicators like training, pre-task planning, prevention through design. That's what David was talking about. If I design my equipment appropriately, right, I can help reduce my hazards. So you can go up the scale very far, right? And the further you go, the more efficient or the best results you're going to get. Leading indicators are proactive or can be proactive if you act on the information timely enough. Lagging indicators are reactive. So this is like the best summary of the difference between leading and lagging indicators. Now, here's the traditional safety observation. You have a checklist, it's on a clipboard. Somebody walks around, checks some boxes. You walk an entire mine and you check one box for each hazard. That's typically how worksite safety observations are done. So let's say, for example, I'm looking at housekeeping. I have to summarize, is it good or bad across my entire worksite? That's tough, right? What if I have a couple spots that aren't so good, right? If the majority is good, do I say it's overall good? That's kind of hard to measure, right? It's typically paper-based, right? And then it ends up in a filing cabinet somewhere, and nobody ever looks back at it. There's broad generalizations across the entire site instead of specific observations that are recorded. It's typically filed in a folder or a cabinet or, in the US we call it a circular file, which is it eventually makes it to the trash, right? It's unable or difficult to drill down to specific details as well. For example, if I were to ask you, how many fall protection unsafe observations did your company make in the last year? How about the last 3 years? Right? It's very difficult to go back and mine that data to be able to get trends. So that's the old way. What I'm advocating is a new way, right? There's some new methodology which basically says you identify your hazards by category and by subcategory. For example, under personal protective equipment, that's your category, you have subcategories like eye protection, head protection, foot protection, right? You're going to record safe observations, right? Why safe observations? I'll give you a great example. Let's say I had 2 crews, and I'm only collecting unsafe observations, because that's what we typically do in safety. We go out, we find something that's wrong, we smack it, right, and we fix it, and then we never look back, right? But let me give you a great example. I've got 2 crews in the mine, and I'm making observations. and I go for a full week, one has 5 unsafes in electrical, right? One has 0 unsafes in electrical. So which one is safer? Right? One had 5 unsafes, one had 0. And you'd think, hey, the guy with 0, the crew that had 0 unsafes is safer. But unfortunately, 0 can mean one of two things. It can mean he worked safely, or that crew was not observed at all. Safe observations. Our system, our database has about 160 million worksite safety observations. For every unsafe observation, we typically get about 30 to 35 safe observations. That's 30 to 35 times you can tell me what did you focus on when you're out there making a worksite safety observation. It can also historically show you what did you look at, who did you look at, where did you look at, right? The other thing it can help me do is I put safe and unsafe observations by category. What do you think the easiest thing is to go out and observe? Typically, people go out and count hard hats and safety glasses, right? When we make safety observations, that's typically what people look at. Unfortunately, that's not where we're getting people hurt. We get people hurt, and if I want to prevent fatalities especially, I need to focus in on caught in between, struck by, fall protection, electrical, or oxygen deficient atmospheres, right? Those are the things that are going to get people hurt. So why shouldn't I focus my attention on those areas? Why? Because it's easier to go out and count hard hat and safety glasses, right? It doesn't take much competency, it doesn't take much effort. But if that's where we're spending time in our worksite safety observations, how can you hope to prevent our fatalities if we're not even looking proactively at those opportunities? So I'm going to collect my unsafe observations as well. I'm also going to, when I find an unsafe observation, you should also apply a severity. Just like you have differences in injuries, you should have an unsafe observation, that risk scale of severity. And for severity, we're basically measuring risk. It's the likelihood of an injury and the consequence of the injury. So think about it like this. If I didn't do a toolbox talk or a weekly training for my crew, that's pretty minor, right? But if I didn't tie off, right, or if I didn't check for gas before I went into a mine, right, those are very high consequence, high severity items. So when I find an unsafe observation, they're going to be very different. So instead of counting unsafe observations, I should also count observations by the potential severity. Why? Well, if I look at the severity, I'm usually going to have fewer opportunities to identify high or life-threatening leading indicators than low, for example, low consequence ones. Which means I'm not going to have as many opportunities to prevent that injury before it leads to a fatality or an injury. So I really have to be aware of those high and life-threatening ones, right, and take quicker action on those than I would for a low and medium. All right. So I determine my severity. We use low, medium, high, and life threat. We do a 2x2 risk matrix of likelihood and consequence to determine that severity. But each observer would go in and make their own determination, and then it's up to the coaching and feedback of the safety department to help coordinate or calibrate each observer to be more aligned with the company. Okay? So now let's get into some case studies. Let's start looking at some specific metrics. And I'm going to share with you what we call several of our safety truths. These are leading indicators that directly correlate with a high injury rate. Okay? We have 4 total safety truths. And as we come across those different ones, I'll share those with you. So let's talk about our highest level, which is the number of inspections versus the number of incidents. So if I were to ask you a question, if I increase the number of worksite safety observations, will that cause a reduction in my number of incidents? What do you think? How many hands say yes? Okay. How many say no? All right, there's a lot of maybes in the room. All right. What we typically see is inspections go up, incidents go down, but it's not definitive. I talked about it earlier. If you don't act on the data that you're finding, nothing is going to happen. Nothing is going to change. So there's a big caveat, a big one. If you don't act on the data that you find, to me it's worthless, right? It's a compliance checkbox. That's all it is. But if you act on the data that you collect, you're going to prevent injuries, right? David had a great example at the coal mines. If we know what the hazards are and we aggressively work to continually improve, we're going to reduce those injuries, especially those fatalities, right? It's not rocket science, right? It's recognizing and controlling those hazards. You know they exist. You can't ignore that they don't exist. So you have to aggressively act on those observations. Now, so inspections can reduce loss, and you can leverage an increase in participation on that. So this is our safety truth number one. The more inspections, the fewer the incidents we typically see. That's our safety truth number one. This is a 3-year profile showing the same thing, which is an increase in injuries. An increase in observations leads to a decrease in injuries. But it's not that easy. This is a 3-year pattern that shows year one, as they increase injuries, as they increased inspections, they decreased injuries. But then they flatlined. The reason being is, in the early stages, they had early adopters, right? Very progressive, very good projects. This was at a construction company. And they got good results. But then they tried to apply it across the entire organization. They met with some resistance, right? That took about a year before management finally said, this is how we're going to do things. And you can see in the 3rd year, once they made that decision and management got behind it and they started to be very proactive, they saw a big increase. But you have to leverage that organizational support. You need management's commitment. You can't do this without it. You need to get the employees to go out and make those observations to say, here's what we're finding wrong. Management, help us fix these items. Give us the resources, right? Give us that commitment to close these items in a timely manner, right? But it's not pretty, right? It takes a lot of effort and change to go from our traditional measure by failure to measure by accomplishment. Now, here's an interesting one. This one, for each of those diamonds, it represents a facility. For example, each of those diamonds could be a mine. Each of those diamonds could be a construction project. And what we typically see is the more inspectors, the more people collecting data, the better that is, or the fewer the injuries that we typically see. So the more people collecting data. So that's where you get your employee involvement. You get employees to go out and collect worksite safety observations. You get management. You get your safety department. Everybody should be contributing to that. Now here's an interesting one. This one scared me. This is safety truth number 2. At the top, it shows each of those facilities where the only people collecting safety observations were safety team members. They had the highest number of injuries. So the facilities where the only people collecting worksite safety observations were safety people had the highest number of injuries. And as the diversity increased, the incidents decreased. Why do you think that is? I'll sum it up in one word. It's called ownership. If safety is the only one collecting safety data, where does management look or where do they think safety belongs? To the safety team. Therefore, they push off any responsibility for safety onto the safety team. You think that's right or wrong? Safety belongs to line management, period. Safety should be a resource to line management, right? So you need to have a diverse workforce out there collecting worksite safety observations, okay? So more inspectors, fewer incidents, but a greater team diversity, that's safety truth number 2, is fewer injuries, right? So you have to leverage who does those worksite safety observations. And remember, safety people are going to collect data differently than non-safety people, but it's up to the safety person to coach people to become better worksite safety observers, right? Because if you have a manager walk by an unsafe condition or see an unsafe behavior and does nothing about it, then you're going to have injuries, right? Let's look at another metric. It's not just your unsafe count, it's unsafe observations or an unsafe per inspection average. And there's a big difference, right? Why do we do unsafe per inspection? Well, if you divide your number of unsafe count or your number of unsafe observations by the number of inspections, you're going to get this metric. Why do we do that? The great thing is you can normalize that metric. It's normalized for both large facilities and small facilities. Because typically a large facility is going to have more observations, right? Because there's typically more people versus a small one. But if you do an unsafe per inspection average, you're going to be able to compare small and large the same, which is good, right? You're going to be able to determine what is normal. As you collect unsafe observations through your worksite safety inspections, you're going to get a company average, right? It is what it is. It's whatever numbers you put into the system. And as you deviate from that, you're going to be able to spot outliers, right? People that are sites or facilities that are very different from the company average. You'll also be able to set a range for expectations. As you get that normalization, that company average, you're going to be able to say, hey, here's our threshold. If it goes beyond, say, 1 standard deviation or 2 standard deviations from the norm, then we need to take action, right? Because it's very different than what we typically see, right? And we can track actual performance, meaning I'm going to see differences quickly on my action taken as well. So that's why we use the unsafe per inspection metric instead of just an unsafe count. Now, let's take a look at this. The yellow or amber line is my company average. That's my average number of unsafes per inspection. The blue line is a specific facility. Notice that big spike in the number of unsafes. They were tracking fairly close to the company average, and all of a sudden now they're different. They're very different. But now I can quickly see that, and I can drill down into that data. I can pull up the number of unsafes versus the number of inspections. So as the unsafes are going up, my inspections are actually going down. So now I'm kind of scratching my head. Typically, as things become more at risk, more unsafe, I would expect them to be more diligent and go out and do more safety inspections. So what do you think it is? I call up the facility, and it's, hey, we're behind schedule. We have a big production increase. We really have to get the stuff out the door, right? We're under a strict deadline. Everybody's working overtime. Everybody's doing everything they can. So I call that safety first, right? Safety is the first thing out the door when you have that kind of production problem. So I see a huge increase in the number of unsafes, a decrease in the number of inspections. That's the perfect storm before it leads to an injury. But this is all consequence-free. Nothing's happened yet. But I can quickly see something bad could result. So now I can mobilize my resources. I can get people from other facilities, including myself. I can go out and give them an extra hand, an extra set of eyes and ears to help cut off or prevent that injury, right? Why? Because I was able to see the data, able to see that they're very at risk, very different, right? I'm forecasting a big increase in injuries if we keep things status quo, keep things the way they are. Okay. As we look at unsafe per inspection, this is what I call our bathtub model. This is safety truth number 3. Our term is called flying blind, but my term for this is called appearance-based safety. Appearance-based safety. What it means is everything looks great, no problems. We are awesome, right? Everything looks good when I go out and make my safety observations until when? Well, until I have an injury, then I go out and do my incident investigation, and I find out we've been doing it that way for months, right? And ignoring it. This is what most people want to see. Nothing's ever wrong, nothing's ever wrong, right? But this does not help prevent injuries. When we see a facility with a high count of 100% safe inspections, that's a red flag in our model. What we found is facilities that had a high count of 100% safe inspections had a high injury rate. You can see the risk curve all the way up and to the left. It's saying those facilities had a lot of injuries because they weren't aggressively looking at their hazards. They weren't aggressively trying to prevent injuries. They were trying to say nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong. On the flip side, if you find unsafe observations, a lot of unsafe observations over and over and over again, that's very high risk as well. What this is let's say, for example, I go out and I find something unsafe on a crew. Let's say, for example, they're not wearing their PPE, right? Or the drivers aren't heeding the safety protocols, right? But let's say I see that today. I record an unsafe tomorrow. I record an unsafe the next day, right? I keep seeing the same thing over and over and over again. And that's typically how we do a safety observation. I go out and say, put on your safety glasses, right? Wear your protection, right? Drive safer, right? Follow these rules. And we call that whack-a-mole, right? So a mole pops up and we whack it, right? And we keep doing that, expecting it to make change. How many times do I have to talk to that employee or that crew before they get it? 6, 7, 8, 10, 12, 50? I don't know. Why should I keep seeing the same things over and over? So as we start to see my unsafe per inspection increasing, I need to find out what is the root cause. Why are they not wearing their safety equipment? Is it a cultural issue? Is management saying, who cares? Right? I have to identify why they're not doing it and fix it. Do they not have the resources? Do they not have the training? Do they not have the commitment? I need to identify why that's not happening and make it so that it doesn't happen again. Right? How would I know it got better? I need to take some kind of action, right? Some kind of action to say, hey, we have to break this cycle. And then I need to measure again and continue to measure to see, did it make any difference? Right? We are very famous in the safety industry to put these corrective action plans in place and never follow up to see if anybody's actually following them. Right? So we have to go out and continue to measure to see if we get better. So the ideal position is what we call find and resolve. You can see it's not zero risk, but it's the lowest risk that we found. And that's where we find unsafe observations and we seek out unsafe observations. Opportunities where what we want to have happen in our health and safety plan and what's actually happened are deviating. And we need to work to align those. We have to be aggressive in doing that if we want to prevent injuries. We put health and safety plans in place for a reason. But if you took your health and safety plan from another mine and just said, change the name on it, right? Is that going to be an effective health and safety plan at your mine or at your facility? No, because you have no buy-in, you have no ownership, right? And that's typically what we see, right? You don't even know why we have that rule in place, therefore why should we follow it? Now let's talk about severity of those findings. We talked about when you find an unsafe observation, what do we do to, when we find it, we need to rank it by consequence. So I'm going to skip through the poll question, but you can see on average, we see more low severity findings than we do medium, more moderate severity findings than high, more highs than life-threatening, right? So this is very similar to Heinrich's triangle, right? So how do you prevent incidents if you identify and act on these at-risk findings? But you can see you have a lot fewer opportunities to prevent injuries at the high and life threat level, typically because people aren't focusing their attention on those, and typically you have fewer opportunities, right? I can go out and count hard hats and safety glasses, those are my low to moderate, all day long, every day, hundreds of them. But how many opportunities do I have to monitor fall protection or confined space entry or atmospheric testing or struck by, my vehicles, right? So that's where you need to focus your attention. Now, where Heinrich deviates in the safety industry is how people interpret it. This is a collection of all of my unsafe findings for all categories. But what we typically do is we typically focus on my moderate to low severity findings because I typically have more incidents, right? My cuts, right? My bruises, right? My strains and sprains, my low severity findings. That's what drives up my incident rate. And that's bad because that's what we get measured by. So I'm going to focus my resources on fixing my injury rate, and I'm going to forget to go out and look for what's going to get people killed. So I want to show you what Heinrich really said. Heinrich said that ratio, my 1 to 29 to 300, the Heinrich ratio, applies only to the common cause. Meaning, if I want to prevent, if I focus on the minor issues, it will not fix my major issues. If I go out and address hard hats and safety glasses, is that going to address people getting struck by vehicles? Is that going to get people prevent people from falling? Absolutely not. So if I want to prevent falls, I need to focus on fall protection. If I want to prevent struck by, I need to focus on how are people going to get struck. So Heinrich, these ratios should only apply, and you should only start to look at them as they relate to a common cause, right? Which is this, okay? So I want to make sure that's very clear, right? If you want to prevent fatalities, you have to look at what is going to cause a fatality, and then make sure you're out there observing those types of activities, right? So let's take a look at two organizations as it relates to severity. My blue line represents my observations, my observation count, and the yellow line represents my severity count, right? My high severity count. Notice the similarities. As my inspections go up, my severity goes up. So does it look like they're really addressing these unsafe conditions, or are they just counting those unsafe conditions? To me, it looks like they're just counting them, right? They're not really fixing anything. Let's take a look at this second organization. As their observations go up, the high severity findings are going down. But what do you think it took within that organization to get them to start acting on these high severity counts? It took a fatality at the organization to go, hey, we saw it coming, we just chose not to do anything about it. That's sad. If you can see it coming through your observations, then you have the duty of care. You have an obligation as a safety and health representative to aggressively control, mitigate, right, eliminate that hazard. Okay. So this company saw very minor change. This one, the second company, actually had a big decrease in the number of injuries, But again, it was a very costly learning process. It took somebody dying, right? Somebody did not go home to their family so that company could learn from his mistake. Is that how we want to learn from our mistakes, right? Is that how we want to improve on the lives of our workers? I would hope not. The other thing that is very interesting is how we correct the unsafe observations that we find. We call this the hierarchy of control. And most companies tend to look at behaviors in PPE, right, or even administrative controls the most. But the problem with that is the more you rely on administrative, PPE, and behavioral, the more you have to manage those processes. You need more oversight, more feedback, the more you rely on those low-level controls. So if you're going to have primarily administrative, behavioral, and PPE controls, then you better have a lot of line supervisors who are out there making sure people are doing the things they should be doing. But if I can eliminate the problem through a better designed vehicle, for example, or if I can substitute the way that we do a work activity, for example, dust control, right? If I can engineer out the hazard, right? For example, David's example, if I can move the noise emissions away from the worker, it's going to be a lot more effective than if I try to protect it on the other end through some kind of administrative controls or PPE, right? So focus on hierarchy of control. And the great thing about it is as you collect these worksite observations, as you develop these trends, you're going to have evidence-based data to bring to management to say, here's why we need to make a more effective change. We need to engineer this out. Here's why. Here's this big trend of unsafe observations that we're just chasing our tail on that we need to solve for long term. That's where the hierarchy of control comes in. The more effective at the top, the least effective at the bottom. At the bottom, you need more oversight, more management control to make sure those are followed and adhered to. What we find when we close out open issues is the majority of open issues, unsafe observations, are closed right away, 82%. But the remaining 18%, 81% of those takes longer than 48 hours to close out. So what we find is if it's not addressed immediately, often it gets forgotten about, right? Until we have an injury and go, yeah, we should have fixed that a while ago, right? So you have to make sure you're monitoring when you find an unsafe observation, how quickly are you resolving that, all right? How quickly you're making it safe and how quickly you're resolving that. Now, I'm going to talk real briefly about Deming's continuous improvement model, plan, do, check, act. So the purpose of observations, worksite safety observations, I want to prevent injuries. So I need people to collect that data. I need to have a plan to use that data. I need to communicate the findings of that data up and down the chain from workers to management. Okay, that's my health and safety plan. I'm going to go out and collect my data. I need to have a strategy to make sure I'm looking at the right things, the right crews and contractors, the right areas of my facility. Okay? I need to make my observations and make my initial corrections. This is where most people stop. This is where most companies stop. I call that the plan, do, hope, pray method. They hope and they pray nobody's going to get hurt, right? The next logical step is as you collect this data in a method that you can retrieve it, right, in some kind of database, right? Hopefully better than Excel because you have all these facilities across the map, right? We want to roll those up into one database. I need to study that data. I need to review the data regularly, identify any gaps or trends. A gap would be something like, hey, I've got all these fall hazards, but I'm not looking at fall observations, right? A gap would be, hey, I've got these crews, but I haven't gone out and observed them, right? Or I have these mines that haven't been observed in 2 weeks. So I need to have look at a gap. A trend would be unsafe after unsafe, right? And then I need to act on that data, right? I need to act and give feedback, drive accountability, make corrective action plans, and eventually make data-driven decisions. And my study and act should drive my next set of observations, right? If I've identified a gap or a trend, I should make sure I go out and look at it. So as I wrap up, start with the end in mind, right? Make sure you understand why you're collecting these worksite observations, okay? Leading indicators are going to give you what is wrong, but not why. It's up to you to figure out why and to put some kind of action into place, okay? So that's all I have. I know I went a few minutes over, but we'll take questions and answers. Do you have headphones?
Los auriculares, por favor, para nuestro expositor. Vamos a solicitarles sus preguntas para el ingeniero Cary Asri, por favor en un número limitado, porque estamos con muy pocos minutos. Vamos a pedir como máximo 4 preguntas. Por favor, levanten la mano para alcanzarle el micrófono. Hay una pregunta allí, por favor, le alcanzamos el micrófono. Segunda pregunta. Tercera pregunta. ¿Hay alguien más? Cerramos con la tercera pregunta, ¿correcto? 1, 2 y 3. Gracias.
Buenos días. Bueno, gracias por la exposición. Estuvo bastante interesante. Y mi consulta es, ¿cómo hacemos para poder combinar ambos indicadores, los leading y los laggings?
So the question is, how can I combine leading and lagging indicators? When you have lagging indicators, sometimes it could uncover the fact that you're not looking at the right things from a leading indicator standpoint. I'll give you a great example. We had one company who had a lot of strains and sprains, like back injuries. But if you look at their leading indicator checklist, they were not looking at material handling. They were looking at no ergonomics, no human factor type observations. So you can't prevent what you're not looking at. So use your lagging indicators, both from your company, your facility, and the industry, to make sure you're looking at the right things and that your checklist, your safety checklist, is comprehensive enough to ensure you're looking at all the hazards. In addition, you want to use if you're having a lot of injuries in, let's say, fall protection, you make sure you're getting people to look at those areas where you're getting injuries. Because if you're not looking at enough, you can't prevent enough. Does that answer your question?
Buenos días. La consulta es referente a, en la etapa de planeación, se hace una identificación de peligros, una evaluación de riesgos y se determinan los riesgos más críticos. Digamos, han hecho ustedes una correlación para poder ver los resultados de las inspecciones en la determinación de, digamos, los indicadores críticos que les bota con los resultados de esta evaluación. Si se ha dado ese caso o qué les ha dado la experiencia que ustedes han tenido en la, digamos, confrontación de ambas informaciones, los resultados de las inspecciones con lo planeado, que serían los resultados de la identificación de peligros y evaluación de riesgos.
Sure. So the planning stage is very important, but you don't know what you don't know, right? So you're going to have to take your best shot. You're going to have to get your data based on what you do know today. You have to learn, as David said, this is a living type of operation. You have to learn from your mistakes, and you have to adapt new ways of looking at things. So the planning stage is very critical, but you have to start somewhere. Don't get hung up trying to find the perfect checklist or the perfect thing. Get out there. If you talk to workers and engage with them, they're going to tell you what's going to get them hurt, and make sure that you're put that in and you're taking actions to remedy that. So again, the planning stage is just your starting point. Go out and collect that data. Get interviews with workers. Study your data, and then make changes accordingly. Right? It's the continuous improvement that's going to lead to a reduction in injuries, right? Not just the collection of data, not having the perfect checklist. You have to study and act on that data to drive the incidents down. So if you want to prevent injuries, it's got to be a continual effort, right? Because you're always going to have new things. As new workers come in, as new managers come in, as new economic pressures come in, you're always going to have to adapt, and you're going to have new things that are going to crop up that could bite you, right? So it has to be an aggressive program to make sure you're constantly going out and looking at things. So it has to evolve. Does that answer your question?
Buenos días. La consulta que le quería hacer es sobre, ustedes han hecho los indicadores en función a las inspecciones. ¿También desarrollaron específicamente con respecto al I per se, por ejemplo? Le decía, aquí utilizamos bastante el I per se, que es la identificación de peligros y evaluación de riesgos. ¿Esto como herramienta de gestión y le han puesto indicadores a esto?
If you look, David had a slide. It says, I first have to identify my hazards. Right? That's what I was talking about mostly. The next step in the risk assessment is you have to analyze those hazards, and then you have to basically, after you evaluate those hazards, you have to act on those hazards, which is eliminate, mitigate, or tolerate, right? So I would say it's definitely has a management commitment aspect, because if you find, hey, you want to eliminate or mitigate, and management says, no, I'm okay with that, you've got a big gap, a big problem. So remember, risk assessment is identify the hazards. That's through your observations. You have to evaluate them. That could be part of the review of your data. But the next step is very critical, is what do we do? Where do we go from here? Do we fix it and move on, or do we go and try to address it long term? Meaning eliminate through engineering controls or elimination or substitution. Do we mitigate it through administrative controls, PPE, or behavioral observations or behavioral feedback? Or do we just tolerate it and say that's just a part of doing business? So it's a three-step process from a risk assessment standpoint, but it's going to take everybody from employees to management to get to where you want to go.
Buenos días. Mi consulta está enfocada, o mi pregunta está enfocada en base a lo que usted mencionó acerca de los análisis y estudios que han mostrado. Si yo incremento inspecciones, entonces en consecuencia mi número de incidentes debería reducirse, debería bajar, ¿correcto? Es parte de la propuesta. Mi pregunta puntual es, ¿cómo mejoro yo esa calidad de esas inspecciones? Porque yo puedo tener estándares, procedimientos, puedo tener normas, pero ¿cómo hago que el foco, el ojo de la seguridad se enfoque en lo crítico, ¿no? ¿Qué tips o qué herramientas nos podría dar?
Sure. So That's a two-part question, in my opinion. The first part is there were 4 safety truths. One is increasing inspections. The other is getting greater diversity of observers. The other one is making sure you're not putting 100% safe all the time. That's quality, right? So the first 2 are more quantitative. The quality ones come from, I have to be honest and put my unsafe observations on the table. So I don't want to see a lot of 100% safe inspections. We know we have a hazardous atmosphere, right? We know we have hazardous conditions. We have to talk about them. So that's number 1. Number 2 is when we find the same things over and over, we have to look at how do we fix this long term? Because I can't keep looking at the same thing over and over and over again, right? I have to fix it. So make sure you're addressing all 4 safety truths. If I just do increase my inspections, that not necessarily is going to fix things. Remember, I have to act on the data that I find as well. Specific to quality of observations, to me, there's really 6 metrics. The participation, how many inspections that they do, the number of safe observations they find, the number of unsafes per inspection, right? Safe per inspection, unsafe per inspection, the severity of their findings, their frequency of 100% safe inspections, that's not good, right? And the comments that they put with their unsafe observations. So really we're looking at specific metrics that you would get just by checking boxes and filling out a card. You can look at those metrics and see, hey, are they looking at PPE or are they looking at some higher severity, higher consequence things? So in the beginning, I would focus on quantity over quality. But as you start to get data and you get your normalization, then you can start going, what are my expectations around these individual metrics? And how can I compare each individual to that normalized curve, right? Or that normalized line. So once you have developed some data, you can start to use it to engage in quality. But part of that is you're going to have to engage with each observer, right? Teach them what to look for, teach them why they're looking for things, which is to prevent injuries, right? And not just to fill out a card, right? So it really takes an effort to coach people if you want good quality observations. But I've always find get quantity so you can get a baseline and then work to improve quality from there. Okay.
Realmente la presentación de ingeniero Kari Azri es muy motivadora y de hecho va a, por parte de ustedes, encargar muchas inquietudes. Vamos a poder conversar con él en breves momentos. Pedimos sinceras disculpas a Mike Allen por esta demora que hemos tenido en el tiempo y despedimos a Kari Azri con un muy fuerte aplauso.